Hi, everybody. My name is Stefanos Georganos. I'm the director of the Remarque Institute. And it's a pleasure to be here again today, second time in 2 days. So if I'm a little dysfunctional, forgive me. It's not quite going the way that we and together with Sam Paul and Amy Nguyen on behalf of the Institute itself, and to get the chance to introduce Lopes, Arne Westad, Natalia, Telepneva, and Monique Bedasse. So the idea is to be able to talk about the new book that's co-edited by Hui and Natalia, and we'll let them go ahead and present first, and then people commentary. So here I begin with the introductions. Forgive me. Hui Lopes is a fellow at Remarque this semester and also the vice director of the Institute of Contemporary History at Nova University of Lisbon in Portugal. Hui is also an honorary research fellow at the School of Historical Studies at Birkbeck, University of London. He is the co-founder and editorial board member of Práticas de la Historia da Historia, journal on theory, historiography, and uses of the past. The author of the book, West Germany and the Portuguese Dictatorship, 1968 to 1974, between Cold War and Colonialism, which appeared in 2014. While at Remarque, he is working on the project Visualizing the Cold War as national production and circulation of visual spy fiction. The key part of this was left until the very end of that part, the spies part, which is really cool. His bigger project includes an upcoming book about spy cinema, politics in the 1960s and 1970s. We go to hear we talk about that project in the internal seminar, which is incredible. Now, last but obviously not least, he is the co-editor of the book that he's here to present and we're here to discuss today, Globalizing Independent Struggles of Lusophone Africa, Anticolonial and Postcolonial Politics, which has just appeared. Now, joining him in presenting the book is his co-editor, Natalia Telepneva, who is lecturer in international history at the University of Strathclyde and is also taught at Warwick and at the LSE. She's not physically here in the room with us, but she's the author of Cold War Liberation, the Soviet Union and the Collapse of Portuguese Empire in Africa, 61 to 75, which was published in 2021, and the editor of Warsaw Pact Intervention in the Third World, published in 2008. Now, along with the two of them, we have with us two commentators. First, my amazing colleague in the history department here at NYU, Monique Bedasse. Monique is the author of Jah Kingdom, Rastafari, Tanzania, and Pan-Africanism in the Age of Decolonization, which was published in 2017, and which received not one, but two major awards. Monique is a leading figure in the study of Black internationalism and joined NYU in 2021. 22. That's it. I was 50-50. After teaching at Washington University in St. Louis. And also Arne Westad, who is the Elihu Professor of History at Yale University, and is also taught at LSE and at Harvard. He is the author of 16 books, most of which deal with 20th century Asian and global history. Most famous among them in the US are The Global Cold War, Third World Interventions in the Making of Our Times from 2006, Restless Empire, China and the World since 1750 from 2012, and of course, The Cold War. The title is The Cold War, not, of course, The Cold War. A World History from 2017. The most recent book, so far as I know, is Empire and the Righteous Nation, 600 Years of China-Korea Relations. So please join me in welcoming all four of our speakers today into the... Now, the way that I think we're going to go is that you're going to speak first, then we'll have the two comments by Monique, Arne, and then Elias wants to speak. Great.
Okay, so thank you. As a historian, I'm fascinated with origin points, and this book has several origin points in Lisbon, in St. Petersburg, in Bissau, in the Santiago island of Cape Verde. And I will begin by focusing on just one of them, which is London, and in particular, the London School of Economics, where Natalia and me first met back when we were doing our PhDs, and I was trying to figure out why the West German governments had backed Portuguese colonialism, and she was trying to figure out why the Soviet government had backed the liberation struggle against Portuguese colonialism. And so we soon found that we had, first of all, a shared interest in what at the time we felt was a seriously under-researched history of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe. And it's their unusually prolonged rule by a country as small and poor and peripheral as Portugal. And not just an interest in the brutal colonial wars that took place from 1961 to 74, but on what we felt were like the vibrant and creative and quite intellectually stimulating strategies adopted by the liberation movements in these colonies. We also shared the conviction that in order to properly grasp what had taken place, we needed to look around the world at larger historical processes, as opposed to the sort of narrow national frameworks with which they had been studied thus far. And there are, of course, many academic and scholarly inspirations for this conviction. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight a couple. One of them was a book that by then had been published relatively recently, which was Arne Westad's The Global Cold War, which first situated these processes at the core of the Cold War's expansion to the Third World. So we are very happy to have you here today, so completing the cycle, even if we have to drag you back to the Cold War, which you have been trying to escape.
I've succeeded halfway, so it's okay,
At Goldsmiths University, I had the opportunity to teach an eye-opening module called Africa in the Global Political Economy, designed by Brandon Griffith-Jones, who remains one of the most insightful scholars about Lusophone anti-colonial thinking. And at the Institute of Contemporary History in Lisbon, José Neves challenged me to coordinate a sort of a large project about the figure of Amilcar Cabral, the historical leader of the struggle for the liberation of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde. And that project, called Amilcar Cabral from Political History to the Politics of Memory, included among its participants Natalia, Telepneva, and in fact, many of the authors in this book. In a sense, to some degree, this book is the product of conversations developed over time between a group of people around questions such as how to recognize like the wider dynamics that shaped Lusophone colonialism and decolonization without sidelining the fundamental agency of local actors like the liberation movements. And to what extent is Lusophone even a helpful or a misleading category, not to mention a neo-colonial conceptual lens? In this book, you will not find definite answers to these questions, but hopefully you will find plenty of material for people to consider and engage with these issues. So I'll jump now to late 2019, when the Amilcar Cabral project was wrapping up. And I think it's fair to say that Natalia and me no longer felt so alone. In fact, there had been a huge surge of interest in these topics, and this has been a very rich decade and a half. And it was Natalia who came up with the idea of sort of bringing together all these scattered people writing articles, books, and kind of bring them together into something more coherent. And so we planned this wonderful workshop to take place in Scotland in the middle of 2020. And I do not have to explain to you why this ended up being replaced by an online seminar. But I am very glad it did, because of the online seminar format, we were able to have hundreds of viewers from all over the world, and together participants from Lusophone and non-Lusophone Africa, from East and Western Europe, from South and North America. And many of them are the contributors that ultimately made this book. The book is about the politics of the independence struggles of Lusophone Africa, from the wars in the 1960s to the structural adjustment plans in the 1980s, which is another way to say that it is a book about Sweden. and about Italy, and India, and Cuba, and Tanzania, and Zambia, and Yugoslavia, and many other places. So we are very grateful to the editors, to our editors at Bloomsbury for immediately embracing this project and including it in their pilot open access program. So the book is free to download for everyone legally and not just through Russian websites that we all know. Also, we are extremely grateful to NYU's Remarque Institute, to staff and Sam and Amy and Lauren, not only for hosting this event, but also for inviting Monique Bedasse, whose work overlaps with many of the themes that we wanted to explore in this book. So we are very eager to listen to her take on it. New York is also quite loaded symbolically as a location because it was a place that was visited by the leaders of the liberation movements fairly frequently in order to promote their cause. And in fact, in the cover of the book, you can see Marcelino dos Santos from Frelimo and Amilcar Cabral from the page is sitting at the United Nations. And I would add the reason we chose this picture is not just that they're sitting there like they belong. And these visits to the UN were very important, I would argue, not just for the diplomacy of the liberation movements, but for the UN itself. They had a transformative and often disruptive impact on the debates and on the concepts being sort of discussed in the UN at the time, as argued in the chapters by Joseph Parrott and Aurora Santos. And so we are very proud of this book, and I just want to, before handing over to people who did not have to see it come to light and probably have like a more distant relationship with it, I want to sort of underline sort of 3 takeaway, I think, contributions that we hope this book can make. The first one, and to quote Martin Thomas and Andrew S. Thompson, is a contribution to this emerging notion that decolonization was a globalizing process. So by which we mean that the sort of struggle and achievement of independence of new nations actually involved forging new connections and circulation of people, of books, of guns, of medications, blood transfusions, films, money, and ideas. So on the one hand, the liberation movements themselves were not just thinking nationally, but they were inserting themselves and inserting their struggle and their projects in other imaginations and other debates, from Marxism and Third Worldism to Pan-Africanism. And this applies both to the larger movements like the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, but also to smaller movements like the Mozambican Coremo, as discussed respectively in the chapters by Rita Naja and Laszlo Passemieres. And on the other hand, their anti-colonial struggle resonated throughout the world. So in Canada, leftist activists linked it to the cause of the independence of Quebec. In Brazil and Chile and Argentina, far-right security forces and secret services addressed it as part of a global communist threat. So here I'm referring to the chapters by Marcel Paredes and Giselle Lobato, who analyze both of these sort of ramifications. The second big contribution we hope to make with this book has to do with the notion that rather than treat Lusophone Africa as an outlier, as is often the case in sort of, especially in Anglo-Saxon historiography, rather than treat it as an aberration, we feel that inserting it in the grand narratives helps complicate and reconsider those narratives. Not list sort of the most benign narratives of globalization and African decolonization that continue to treat violence as an exception in an otherwise smooth process of transition of power. And so with that in mind, Ana Moledo inserts sort of the Lusophone colonies in the reconceptualization of Southern Africa and in the evolution of international discourse about human rights. And Julian Schwartz Souza inserts them in the broader history of the Sino-Soviet state and its ramifications from Cairo and Algiers to Havana and Khartoum. And with so many events about fascism and anti-fascism here at Remarque in this past couple of weeks, understandably, I also cannot resist pointing out that the Carnation Revolution, which ended almost 5 decades of fascism in Portugal, was not just a catalyst for the decolonization of these countries, but also, as it has become increasingly acknowledged, it was itself the direct result of the anti-colonial struggles waged by these Africans. Finally, the third contribution. This book shows, we hope, that the construction and constitution of post-colonial nation states was itself a deeply transnational process. And in fact, it raises questions about the very dichotomy between national and transnational. I still think these are useful concepts, but they tend to be presented as merely oppositional or mutually exclusive. And I think this collection of essays shows that historically they were often also complementary and articulated and interconnected and mutually constitutive in fascinating, if often quite problematic ways. And so the book not only zooms into the CAA contacts in pre-independence Angola and Polish investment in post-independence Angola in the chapters by Alex Marino and Przemysław Gastold, but it also explores the compromises of the governments of São Tomé and Cabo Verde in order to fund their nation-building processes, which shaped their economic and foreign policies, as studied by Inês Nascimento Rodrigues, Gerhard Seibert, Victor Barros, Oswaldino Monteiro, and Suzana Costa. Likewise, the final chapter, which I co-wrote with Paulo Cunha and Catarina Laranjeiro, shows how the struggle for cultural independence in Guinea-Bissau continued way beyond the recognition of state sovereignty, and it involved not only the policies of the PAIGC, but also American distributors, French filmmakers, North Korean war movies, spaghetti westerns, Mexican melodramas, and heated debates about Hong Kong Kung Fu cinema. So it's a mess. We hope it's a productive mess, but with this idea of a mess, this brings me to sort of my very final note. So Guinea-Bissau had the latest in a series of military coups less than a year ago. In Angola, President João Lourenço is currently under fire for refusing to schedule local elections. And in Mozambique, literally as we speak, the latest waves of protests has analysts screaming about the possibility that the nation may be on the brink of a new civil war. And the analysis of these events tend to focus on the mistakes of local political elites, which there have been many, or to blame it on the catastrophic legacy of Portuguese colonialism, which was indeed quite atrocious. But I would argue that, and this is, I think, what I think the book makes this case, that in order to fully understand and critically understand the trajectories of these countries, we need to look beyond such a narrow national focus and understand them as part of a global history shaped by multiple forces and dynamics that interact with and transcend the nation state.
Monique?
Thank you so much, Steph, for the invitation to participate in this conversation, and thanks to you and Natalia for the book. Natalia's contribution to the history of security and intelligence has been very useful for my current project, so we're here, so I thank her. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to engage with this volume, which advances what we think we know about the history of economy, and also offers us analytical pathways for future work. I want to highlight what I perceive to be a couple of important before I move on to offer meditation on how I, as a scholar of Pan-Africanism in particular, in the context of the British Empire, see the history of independence struggles across Lusophone. First, so in order to center the Portuguese colonies, we necessarily had to extend what is perceived to be colonization. I appreciate the argument that this volume offers about periodization. But beyond that reality, the focus on the Portuguese colonies pushes us beyond prevailing ideas concerning when and why different conceptions of independence emerged. Chapter 9, for example, which focuses on the decolonization, and foreign interests in the Portuguese 1965 and 1974 shows that the economic aspect of freedom was on the agenda even before Portuguese colonialism. This undermines the prevailing assumption of a linear process by which African movements and then pursued political or flag independence, then suffered hardships that woke them up to a neo-colonial economy, which for some found voice in later organizations like the South Commission in the 19th. Second, the volume adds well-needed nuance to the study of the liberation movements of Lusophone Africa. For example, the way that Chapter 2 on the Mozambique Liberation Committee insists that we take the lesser-known movements on their own terms. This adds to the work Africanists have done to reframe our approach to decolonization and nationalism, to move away from what Jean Allman calls the modernization question of what went wrong, into a more capacious engagement with the actual dreams and goals of various constituencies, in this case within the ambit of Lusophone liberation movements. So this book pulls us away from the propensity to dismiss some of these splinter groups in favor of the more popular ones that have more easily found their way into the studies we've done about how they interacted with, say, various governments and citizens in exile in places like Tanzania, or the tendency to dismiss groups we associate with more conservative ideological leanings that don't easily fit into the unifying narratives of resistance. I really appreciate that intervention and the rich intellect here. In the time that I have left, I want to think with two of the book's major preoccupations. One, the editor's insistence on a globalizing perspective shows the extent to which these struggles were connected to third worldism, new left activism, the Cold War, etc. The way that the chapters examine the multidirectional connection to the global unfoldment, from the incorporation of external ideas like Marxism to the way that the UN's engagement with Lusophone liberation movements influenced the voting patterns of Latin Americans in a UN meeting. And two, the point that studies of independence have been dominated by British and French empires, often relegated Lusophone. On page 5, the editors refer to the Portuguese Empire's decline as a story, quote, that has been marginalized in the English language historiography. Of course, many of us are narrowly trained that pertain to our specific topics and to a specific empire. That is an issue in African history more broadly. But I want to ruminate on an assertion in the introduction that the focus of the book, quote, can help complicate the grand narratives of decolonization at all. It's typically addressed as a footnote-worthy outlier rather than as constitutive and transformative of the larger history of anti-colonial. I wonder to what extent the prism of both global Black history and the Black historical subjects about whom such historians is the story of the independence struggles in Portuguese colonies. I'm thinking about this because of how large Lusophone independence struggles and liberation movements, the Black imagination, as the intractability of Portugal has always played a major role in seriously undermining the euphoria and optimism of independence. Lusophone liberation movements made it clear that into what was supposed to be the post-colonial. To a great extent, the measure of a newly independent African state's had to do with whether or not it supported the freedom fighters of the Portuguese colonies, along with those of South Africa and Namibia. This significant phase of Pan-Africanism, the point at which its evolution was certainly generated by ideas and activities, and the importance of organizations such as the Liberation Committee. Let me prove the extent to which a history of Africa always been constitutive and transformative anti-colonialism to you, particularly in the so-called post-colonial. Powerful and sustained engagement of people of African descent also took shape in the inclusion of the ideas of freedom from Nelka Cabral, the Black intellectual tradition in and outside of the academy. Such works were parts of a Black canon for the very different Black people in studying and supporting liberation movements in Africa, including those in the American Committee on Africa. There are also histories of how historical actors bridged the divide between Africa, as was the case when Jamaican Prime Minister Michael Manley visited. And his visit was captured in the pages of Tempo, a weekly paper published in Portuguese in This point is connected to the issue of archives and sources. Archives and sources to uncover more perspectives about Lusophone independence movements in a global context from the perspectives of the history of Pan-Africanism. Finally, it was not lost on people of African descent. The liberation of Black people everywhere mattered most. That Portugal's determination to keep its colony, even after the tide had turned, was an important part of the reinforcement of white supremacy. Transnational effort to maintain colonial, racial, and economic hierarchies long after independence, along with the threats of South Africa, unilateral declaration, and neo-colonial forces like the IMF and World Bank. In closing, I underscore the editor's point that there is far more work on decolonization and British empires. I also agree that for some historians, the Portuguese must show up as a part of the main event, so to speak. And I welcome this volume wholeheartedly as a result. But the history of the independent struggle in Lusophone Africa has always been less marginalized for scholars of the Black intellectual tradition and for people of African descent in Africa and across its diaspora. A historical reality that led me to ask, for whom?
Well, it's great to be here, particularly for the first time in this new setting of the Remarque Institute. This institute has a particular place in my heart because Tony just was a great friend and a great mentor of mine, and someone I miss a lot, even now. Since it's at NYU, I also want to mention another great friend and mentor, Marilyn Young. I worked with last time I was visiting NYU for a longer period of time. And she is also greatly appreciated and greatly missed. But having said that, to two friends who are no longer here, it's wonderful to see Louis and Natasha, at least online, who I got to know well in London at the London School of Economics when they were there as students, and I was teaching there, and that was a real joy in many different ways. It was a remarkable milieu of people who had an interest in anti-colonialism, in decolonization, in global socialism that we found at LSE during those years. Became really significant for my own direction as a scholar later on as well in terms of my preoccupations. So it's really interesting to see how this now has developed. You and Natasha coming at it from slightly different angles into looking at the international histories of Portuguese colonialism and African Lusophone socialist internationalism. And I think this is a great book. I mean, it's not easy to do a great edited book. I don't know how far I should go in talking about edited books in general, but there are some good edited books, but there are also quite a few that do not reach the standards that I'm sure the editors would like to set. And I speak here as someone who's been involved in producing a few of those books. Here, I think the standard that you set is high, and in most part, you've actually achieved through the projects that you chose and the authors that you chose to come up with something that is first and foremost coherent. It speaks to the same kinds of issues. I mean, it's not a very sort of disparate collection of articles. But maybe first and foremost, many of these chapters speak to each other. And that I thought was the most impressive part of the book, that the chapters, the authors engage with each other and try to tease out further implications of the arguments that they come up with. And for those who haven't read this, that's visible throughout the book. And it's quite a major success, I think, in terms of taking this whole field forward. So I am going to talk about the Cold War, but I'll get to it by and by. I first wanted to talk about the imperial setting of this, in part because that's what I'm working on at the moment, though more in the 19th century than in a broader setting. I'm trying to do a book on the transformation of imperialisms and empire in the mid 19th century. And I've always been fascinated with the Portuguese Empire because it's an empire that worked in somewhat different ways throughout its existence than many of the other empires that it competed with or sometimes cooperated with. At the point when this book starts to step in that story of the globalizing Portuguese Empire, of course, Portugal in a European context and in a global capitalist context is a country that has been pushed to the margins, but this was not always so, right? I mean, for a very long time, it was Portugal of the world, the Portuguese Empire, and especially people who were not immediately of Portuguese origin, but used Portuguese, became Lusophone as part of the staffing and the equipping, not just of that empire, but of global imperial expansion, and then from the late 18th and early 19th century, global capitalist expansion, to a degree that at least the Anglophone literature, I feel, do not always fully cover. Some of the connectors, some of the glue of that expansion came up through Lusophone, for lack of a better word, or in the Portuguese Empire and at the margins of the Portuguese Empire. And that's interesting with regard to this story as well, because this is, of course, very often what connects the different movements that you are looking at here, the different anti-colonial movements, that these people had gotten to know each other because they had functioned in these kinds of roles. So that transformation that you see then first with the Portuguese Empire becoming closely connected to, first and foremost, British capital expansion in the mid and late 19th century, but also then further through Britain to what happened on the US side in the mid 20th century, is part of the background for this book. And I think you cover that really well in the introduction. And as we know, and Monique already touched upon this, as we know in the study of other anti-colonial projects, that globalization of anti-colonial activism is something that happens, along the lines of these various connectors that exist. I mean, through people's work elsewhere or through study elsewhere, linking up with people who, in terms of distance, even within Africa in this case, we're not close to each other at all. I mean, very few people at the start of this story became key elements in the anti-colonial struggle, say in Angola, had ever been close to Guinea. But they still interacted with revolutionaries from Guinea through these kinds of connectors that existed. They had worked on ships, they had studied in Lisbon, they had met in New York, as you point out. So this particular character of the Portuguese Empire is really interesting in terms of trying to understand how that globalizing tendency that you find with regard to Portuguese-speaking anti-colonialism came up. I'm not saying that it's as a phenomenon is unique. I mean, you find that with other language groups and other empires as well. This is what empires do. They connect not just through their own practices and through the roles that they have as empires. They also help to connect the anti-imperial, the anti-colonial resistance that totally. But there is something particularly striking when your story starts with the Portuguese Empire with regard to this, that I think hasn't really been covered well in any literature that I know of so far in terms of connection. So that's my first point. Second point is about the significance of timing. And in this case, the significance of the timing of the Portuguese Revolution and the decolonization that followed. And this is something I spent quite a bit of time thinking about. It's actually one of the themes in the Global Cold War that I tried to develop. Why did the Portuguese Revolution and the breakaway of the various Portuguese colonies come to play such a big role internationally? And why did these revolutions and revolutionary movements turn in the directions that they did? And this is something I'm very interested in hearing Monique's response to this, because it seems to me that if you look at it through the African lens, much of the reaction that you found among the anti-colonial movements as they made the transition to conquering states and taking over state power was based not just on their experience as movements, but also what had happened in the rest of Africa after the main parts of that continent were at least in some sense decolonized, 15, 20 years earlier. And it is very interesting to see ideologically, maybe first and foremost, how the organizations that come to power in Angola, in Mozambique, in Cape Verde, how they all turn to a different form of interpretations of socialism than what you found in almost all of Africa before then. This is not African socialism. I mean, this is not Tanzania. This is not Nyerere. This is not Kaunda. This is not Dhaka. This is from the very beginning of the revolutionary phase, distinctly turned towards real existing socialism, towards the Soviet Union, towards Eastern Europe, not just in terms of assistance. Assistance point goes without saying. That's where you could get your weapons and your supplies and those kinds of things from. But in terms of how you build an organization and how you structure the state and how you transform society. Of course, there are differences, and the book is very good at pointing this out between the Lusophone states in Africa as they got their statehood. Mozambique had that Frelimo developed in a different direction. It had its most intense phase of Soviet-style socialist transformation very early on during its. And then very quickly, in ways that I also find very interesting, already in the early 1980s, or at least by 1983, 1984, start turning towards a domestic process of development that is more in tune with what is happening with the expansion of global capital and the transformation of the general transformation of the 1980s, before the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe gets into trouble. And there is a great project that should be written about that, because Mozambique is in many ways one of the first countries in which you see that critique of central planning and statist socialism is coming out very clearly. Angola moved in a very different direction and moved increasingly throughout the 1980s in the direction of building a socialist state where the aim was to create it in a form that was very close to the Soviet experience. So what I'm saying here is not just that, I mean, the timing is important. Earlier experience is important. Reading, understanding socialist experiences in Africa is important for what happens slightly later, because they could have that kind of experience. They could have that kind of background. But also it's very interesting how it then came out in slightly different ways with regard to these. On that, I'd be very interested in having both Ruiz and Natasha's comments. Now, the Cold War dimensions of this are interesting to me, first and foremost, in the sense that for both of the superpowers within the international Cold War system, the effects of the Portuguese Carnation Revolution, Portugal itself, but also in the former colonies, became a kind of breaking point. I think a lot of people would argue, maybe more now than when I did the global Cold War 20 years ago, that this is what defeats any attempt at or broader, more long-standing detente between the two power blocks. And that is such an interesting question. I mean, why is that connected to this particular development? Of course, I mean, there are other reasons as well. I will say that it's just the Portuguese Revolution that undid that attempt at dampening competition between East and West. But it did play a major role. And timing, again, plays a significant role with regard to this, but I think it's more than that. I also think it is the choices that were made both in Lisbon and in the former colonies in the first period after the Portuguese Revolution. I think it is and Natasha has written very well about this, I think it is the willingness on the Soviet side to do something that the Soviet Union has never really done before. And that is to engage directly in liberation struggles that are very far away from the Soviet Union itself. It had done so to some extent, and very much after the fact in Cuba. It had done so to a higher degree in Vietnam, but not in the kind of integrated fashion that happened after some time of initial doubt with regard to the support of liberation struggles in Lusophone Africa, maybe especially in Angola, but not only in Angola. It also connects, and that's interesting in terms of our time now, to what is happening here domestically in American politics. So the increased Soviet activism, the socialist turn, both in Portugal and in the former Portuguese colonies, was used by an example, perhaps example number one, by the emerging American right, by the Reaganite right, that the Détente had failed, that the Soviet Union could not be trusted, that the American people had been lied to. And if you look at newspapers from 1975, 1976, you'll see how often these are the examples that are being used, well before anything else starts to happen in other parts of the world. Then finally, pointing forward, so which you do towards the end of the book, and I think that is really fascinating. And there are some sublime ironies here, which are well worth investigating. So one country that I have worked quite a bit on, that were almost universally on the losing side in terms of what happened after decolonization in the Portuguese colonies and in Portugal itself, was China, was the People's Republic of China. Because this came at a point of anti-Soviet hysteria, there's no other way of putting it, in Beijing, and when the PRC allied itself very closely with the United States in trying to defeat the socialist revolutions, the Soviet-supported socialist. First and foremost in Angola, where the Chinese were on the ground, very actively supporting the FNLA. Is a great, really great chapter on Holden Roberto in there, which I much appreciated. But also engaging against the socialist movements in other Lusophone African countries, which of course, and understandably, led to a very difficult relationship between the PRC and Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea for a very long time after the revolutions had been taking place. But look at the situation now. For all of these, and especially for Angola, China is not just their biggest trading partner, it's increasingly an integral part of the economies in these countries. And it will be really interesting to try to figure out more about how that transition actually took place. We have a graduate student at Yale, Jin Shifan, who is now starting to work on this. He grew up in Guangzhou, in a part of that great city where Portuguese was as often heard as Cantonese because of people who came from Angola, came from Mozambique, and settled mainly as traders, but also for other reasons in that southern Chinese city. So starting to understand both through what happened internally at a somewhat later date than where you cut off in terms of that turn toward China and willingness to forget the past and begin working with the Chinese, but also trying to understand this from a social and cultural perspective. That could be a very interesting following up from some of the latter chapters in what I think is a really. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody. It's really great to be here, even though online on Zoom. I'm really grateful to Rui and the Remarque Institute for hosting our book launch for our edited volume, which was, of course, a product of many conversations, debates, and so on and so forth. So we really appreciate also your input from both Monique and Arne, and of course the participants. So unfortunately, I think the mic was somewhat inconsistent at times, so I don't think I fully picked up on all the questions, but so I think Rui will have to answer some of those challenging and interesting questions themselves. I think the main point, as I understood it, of Monique's sort of critique was to actually understand how these struggles for liberation struggles in the Lusophone countries were understood by actually African intellectuals and activists. And, you know, she's sort of asking to what extent is this story actually marginalized? Of course, you know, we understand that this is not linear, and part of our own involvement in the project on Amilcar Cabral, we do say that, you know, there's been incredible interest in Cabral's ideas, and everything that has to do with kind of his contribution to both the theory and practice of liberation studies. But I think in general, there's still a lot of work that has to be done in kind of trying to integrate the story of Lusophone anti-colonial struggles into the recent literature on decolonization and kind of global story as well, because I think still these two literatures, Portuguese-speaking ones and English-speaking ones, are actually are quite separate in many ways. And this is what we wanted to do, and what some of you already picked up on, us trying to position these themes within both the recent Africanist literature and trying to recover, in a certain extent, the minority nationalisms that represented by somebody like Holden Roberto or the Mozambican Caribbean movement kind of is a part of trying to do that. Also, what we wanted to do about, and kind of this is section 1, where we look at the networks that emerged as a result of response to anti-colonial struggles, is how these ideas that came about and emerged in places like Dar es Salaam or Conakry actually influenced also global leftist movements, resistant movements. So basically how they translated into this kind of global narrative of struggle for human rights, domestic rights, such as in Canada. And finally, and I think this is something that Arne was talking about a little bit, is that the timing of de facto legal independence that's finally achieved in 1975. And of course, this was specifically one of the things that we really wanted to achieve, is try to show that the moment of independence was, in fact, in some ways, of course, a turning point, because this is where oftentimes histories of independence struggles and kind of Portuguese colonialism was picked up by Cold War historians oftentimes, and myself included. My kind of original interest was to pick up on the Angolan Civil War and explain how that turned into this internationalized conflict. But what we've tried to uncover is how actually this point of independence was in many ways a continuation of that period of anti-colonial struggle. And I think what we want to talk about, and I know that historians are not always, I won't say comfortable, but don't necessarily like to talk too much about the global economy, especially in very specific terms. But what we wanted to contribute is also how these struggles for economic sovereignty, which started obviously at international organizations. We know a lot about New International Economic Order, but how these Lusophone movements contributed to this debate prior to independence, but also how these desires for economic sovereignty clashed against the realities of global capitalism after independence. So it is in many ways that really interesting moment of the 1970s, where independence is achieved, but at the same time, many of these agendas for cultural liberation, for economic sort of sovereignty, is compromised in many ways by the realities of a kind of global economy and the Cold War. And the final point that I want to perhaps re-emphasize again, Rui talked a little bit about it, is the networks of an anti-communist or anti-communist activists that actually emerged not just the United States, because of course we know a lot about the United States or South Africa, but elsewhere including in Latin America, and how they all were connecting to try to counter that perceived threat from these self-proclaimed Marxist Leninist regimes, for example, in Mozambique and Angola. So I think this would be my main ideas, but I think it would be great to also allow some time for questions and comments from the audience as well, which is usually the fun part.
Would you like to engage a little bit back and forth?
Yes. I would very quickly, although I agree with Natalia that the fun part is still ahead. I do thank you both for your very generous and insightful readings. I'm going to just collectively pick two threads to respond to. First, on Monique's sort of major point, I want to thank you. You are absolutely right, and I guess the easy answer would be to say that you do have like these sadly still quite separated traditions of historiography and just in general thought, and which enable us to marginalized in a way reflecting the very like marginalization of the wider project of Black intellectuals engaging with this history for so long. But I would actually say that I feel quite, I'm quite happy that, that you made that point, in part because I think this is the one part of the book that I can speak about quite confidently, which is the introduction, because I actually co-wrote that part. And this introduction was at one point was almost twice as long. Both me and Natasha are incredibly stubborn historians. So you end up with an introduction in which we discuss every single word in the title at length and explain why it's wrong and criticize the title. And then, of course, Natalia felt like we had to include the background of all the history of going back to the 15th century. And I was trying like to cram in like as much of the state of the art as I could. And it was insufficient in the end, but I feel a bit vindicated because everyone kept telling us that the introduction was too long, and it's not long enough, as you've just shown. So I'm quite happy that I'll get to present this as proof next time around. And on the issue that Arne raised of how these projects came out differently, I guess I'll just focus on what is like very boringly the most like traditional example, which is the section between Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, which is particularly interesting because they both, what they were initially, they came out of the same liberation struggle. They were initially ruled by different branches of the same party, and are today considered, at least in mainstream media discourse, as the most successful and the most unsuccessful of the African states. And our experience in that sense, in the Cabral project, we got to do extensive trips to both of these locations and talk to different people and stage different events. And one thing I think that became clear, and this is going to tie to the point that you made, is how much of this discourse, which is often put in very sort of apocalyptic terms, especially when it comes to Guinea-Bissau, which has been labeled everything from a failed state to a narco state. They keep coming up with new words to describe something that seems very difficult to grasp, in part because it keeps being compared to other states. If these are all isolated units that we can just like put on a board and then evaluate. And what we found in Cape Verde was an insistence that they were different from. This is a different country. This is not even an African country, as it was often said. It's more of a European country, which kind of like points to the direction of how this notion of success and insuccess is being developed. And I think a lot of the times this distance towards Guinea-Bissau, it reflects, and this insistence on this notion of failure and state failure reflects a sometimes quite explicit, but often like implicit sort of criticism of the whole project of African emancipation. And so I am very sensitive. It was one of our driving motivations has always been to not look teleologically at this as a project where it criticises the failure,
Right.
but rather to revisit not only the dreams and aspirations, as you put it, but I would say like the actual incredible and progressive project that it represented, both in those countries and for a lot of people around. Now just kind of simply retroactively dismissed based on what we see.